The ice axe was lying in the snow on the Menlung Glacier when Eric Shipton stepped back to frame the photograph. Its wooden shaft was cold to the touch. The metal head had sunk slightly into the surface, where he had set it down beside the impression in the snow, and in the silence of the glacial cirque, with the high pale light of a November morning at nearly 6,000 meters falling across everything without warmth, the composition he was arranging was a simple one, the axe as a measure, the print as the subject, the surrounding snow as context, the frame of the camera finding its angle in the cold air above the Menlung Basin. The print beside the axe was 33 centimeters long. Its width measured 20 centimeters at the broadest point. The walls of the impression were sharp and clean, the way snow holds a shape at high altitude before the sun has had time to work on it, and the depth of the print in the surface suggested something of considerable weight pressing down through a crust that had not given way easily. Shipton held the frame steady. He pressed the shutter, and in the fraction of a second it took for the image to be recorded onto film in the cold air of the Menlung Cirque, something began, not an event exactly, but a question, documented and dated, and soon to travel very far from the glacier where it was first formed. The Menlung Glacier lies in the Rolwaling Himal region of northeastern Nepal, draining southward from the ridge that marks the border between Nepal and Tibet. To reach it from the Khumbu side, a party must cross the Menlung La, a narrow saddle of wind-scoured rock sitting at high elevation where the sound of distant wind arrives, softened and changed by the walls of the surrounding massif. Below the pass, the glacier descends into a circa, a bowl of rock and ice and permanent snow enclosed on three sides, its floor marked by the slow blue-white surface of the glacier itself, its upper margins, where the rock emerges from the ice gray and cold and largely undisturbed by any regular passage of people or animals. In early November 1951, when Shipton's party crossed into the Menlung Basin, the site had seen virtually no human traffic in the days preceding their arrival. The snow surface was fresh. The conditions for holding a clear impression were nearly ideal. Eric Shipton was not a man given to overstatement. He had been climbing in the Himalaya since the early 1930s, participating in multiple expeditions toward Everest throughout that decade and into the 1940s under the sponsorship of the Royal Geographical Society. And he had developed, over those years, a precise empirical habit of documentation that was characteristic of the best British mountaineers of his generation. The 1951 expedition he was leading had a specific and practical purpose: to map Nepal's southern approaches to Everest, following the opening of Nepal to Western explorers, and to identify a viable route for a summit attempt from the south. The Menlung La crossing was part of that reconnaissance. Shipton's party was moving through the Menlung Basin, not in search of anything particular, but in the course of systematic geographical survey, and what they found there was not what they had come to find. The trackway crossed the snow surface of the glacier at a steady pace. The prints were widely spaced, each one a discrete impression in the snow, and the line they formed moved across the glacier in a direction that carried it eventually onto harder glacial ice, where the surface could no longer hold a clear impression, and the trackway ended without having reached any visible destination. Shipton's party followed the line of prints for approximately 1 mile before it disappeared onto the bare ice. They documented it as they went. The photographs were taken with care. The composition of the most significant image, the one that would be reproduced across the world's newspapers within weeks, was deliberate in its method. The ice axe placed beside the print, not for effect, but for the precise practical reason that it would allow anyone examining the photograph subsequently to calculate the print's dimensions from the image itself, since the length of a standard mountaineering ice axe was a known quantity. Dr. Michael Ward was the expedition's medical officer, and he was present on the glacier that morning. He confirmed, in accounts he gave throughout the rest of his life, that the trackway had been followed for approximately 1 mile before it disappeared onto the harder ice surface. And he maintained consistently that the prints showed no signs of wind distortion or solar modification at the time of discovery, that the walls of the impressions were fresh and sharp-edged when the party first encountered them, and that the morning cold had preserved them in a condition that allowed accurate observation of their shape. Ward was a methodical man, trained in the habits of clinical observation that medicine demands, and his independent confirmation of the physical details Shipton documented gave the discovery a quality of corroboration that single observer accounts cannot carry. Two experienced and careful men, both with reasons to look closely at what was in front of them, recorded the same physical evidence in the same terms. The morning on the Menlung Glacier was quiet in the way that high-altitude mornings are quiet. Not the quiet of an enclosed space, but the open quiet of extreme elevation, where the air is thin enough that small sounds do not carry far, and the surrounding rock and ice absorb rather than return them. The cirque walls rose on 3 sides. The pale snow surface of the glacier stretched across the floor of the basin, its slight undulations casting shallow shadows in the low-angled morning light. And across this surface, running at a steady angle toward the harder ice at the glacier's far edge, the trackway continued, print after print, each one clean-walled and deep, each one measuring the same width and the same length, none of them suggesting any hesitation or irregularity in the stride of whatever had made them. Shipton had seen unusual tracks in the Himalaya before. Most experienced high-altitude mountaineers had encountered impressions in snow that could not be immediately and confidently attributed to a known species, because the conditions at altitude, the sublimation and solar enlargement that can expand a print's dimensions significantly within a few hours of its creation, the compression effects of wind-driven snow, the distortions introduced by uneven melting, regularly produce shapes that do not correspond simply to the foot that made them. He was not a man easily moved to unwarranted conclusion, and the care with which he documented the Menlung prints, the measurement, the composition of the photograph, the placement of the ice axe as a scale reference, the follow-through of tracing the trackway to its end, speaks not to excitement, but to the recognition that these particular prints warranted precise and accurate documentation for later analysis. The photograph was developed and eventually submitted to the Illustrated London News, which published it in November 1951, and the response it generated was almost instantaneous. The newspaper printed on large broadsheet pages, and the image of the Menlung print occupied a substantial portion of a column, the ice axe lying in the snow beside the impression, the scale relationship between the two, unmistakable in the printed image, the clean walls of the print clearly visible in the quality of reproduction that the Illustrated London News had the resources to achieve. Readers in London opened the paper across their laps in the particular November light of English sitting rooms and looked at something that had been photographed less than a month earlier on a glacier most of them could not have located on a map. The photograph was precise, it was dated, it had a named photographer and a named location and a named companion who had been present at the moment of discovery, and none of those anchoring facts made it any easier to say simply and definitely what had made the print in the snow beside the ice axe. The global press reproduction that followed was rapid and sustained. Within weeks, newspapers across Europe, North America, and Asia had reproduced the Shipton photograph. The moment was, for reasons of history and timing, almost ideal for the international spread of a story about the Himalaya. The attention of the Western world had been fixed on Everest since the late 1930s, and the opening of Nepal to foreign mountaineers in 1950 had reactivated that attention and brought a fresh wave of journalists and expedition reports into circulation. The print on the Menlung Glacier arrived into this climate of already heightened interest in the high places of the world, and it arrived in the best possible evidentiary form, a photograph taken by a named and credible photographer with a built-in scale reference from a specific location at a specific elevation on a specific date. What it did not arrive with was an explanation. Shipton did not offer one. Ward did not offer one. The photograph was presented as documentation of something that had been found, not as proof of any particular conclusion about what had made it. And this quality of restraint, the scientific instinct to document first and interpret later, to resist the pull toward premature closure, may be part of what gave the image its particular durability. A photograph that claimed to prove something would have invited refutation. A photograph that simply showed something and left the question open has continued to be discussed, measured, analyzed, and returned to for more than 7 decades, and it has never been definitively explained. The Menlung Basin sits below the Nepal-Tibet border ridge at an elevation that places it firmly and entirely above the permanent snow line. There are no villages in the basin. There is no regular foot traffic, no trade route that passes through it, no seasonal migration of herders or farmers that would bring groups of people across the glacier in the days before Shipton's party arrived. The remoteness of the site was not incidental to the significance of the prints. It was a condition that the documentary record establishes and that subsequent analysis has had to account for. Any hypothesis about what made the prints in the Menlung snow must grapple with the straightforward geographical fact that very few things, known or otherwise, were present in that basin in November 1951. The glacier held the prints, and the party followed them, and they ended on the bare ice, and the snow beyond was unmarked and still. The ice axe in the photograph had a wooden shaft. Shipton had carried it up through the Khumbu and over the Menlung La and down onto the glacier as working equipment, a tool for moving safely on ice and snow at altitude. And when he placed it beside the print in the Menlung snow, it became something additional, a measuring instrument, a reference, a way of making the print's dimensions legible to anyone who would later look at the image. The axe's length made the print's width suddenly and unmistakably readable. The print was not small. It was not the kind of impression that might be explained away by the enlargement effects of altitude sun, because the morning had been cold and the discovery had been recent, and the walls were still sharp-edged when Ward bent down to look at them. The axe lying in the snow beside it was approximately 70 centimeters long. The relationship between the two dimensions in the photograph was clear and unambiguous. A footprint 33 centimeters long is large by any human standard. The average adult male foot in the populations that have inhabited the Himalayan region for centuries falls considerably short of that length. An impression of 33 centimeters made in snow at nearly 6,000 meters above sea level, with walls that were still sharp when first examined, on a glacier in a remote cirque that had seen virtually no recent human traffic, presents a set of physical characteristics that requires some accounting for. Shipton was aware of this. Ward was aware of this. Neither of them produced a confident account of what had made the prints. Both of them documented what they had found with the instruments and methods available to them and reported it accurately. and the question they left open with that act of honest documentation has remained open in the same form for decades. The photograph was reprinted many times after its initial publication in the Illustrated London News. It appeared in books and journals and newspapers across the second half of the 20th century. It was submitted to various kinds of analysis, photogrammetric study, comparative examination of its dimensions against known animal species, review by zoologists and anthropologists and glaciologists who brought different disciplinary frameworks to the same image. The technical capacity for photographic analysis improved significantly over the decades, and each new generation of analytical tools was eventually brought to bear on the Shipton photograph because it remained the clearest and best documented single image in the evidentiary record. No analysis has produced a consensus identification. The species that made the prints has not been established to general scientific satisfaction. One important aspect of the Menlung discovery that the documentary record preserves is the character of the trackway as a whole, not just the individual print that Shipton photographed, but the full mile of impressions the party followed across the glacier's surface. A single print, however well photographed and carefully measured, might theoretically be explained as an anomalous distortion of a smaller original impression, the walls of its enlargement suggesting a size that the original foot did not possess. A continuous trackway followed for 1 mile across a glacier, each print consistent with the others in its dimensions and spacing, presenting a stride pattern and a direction and an eventual disappearance onto bare ice, is a different order of evidence. It is a record of movement, not just of shape. Something moved across the Menlung Glacier in the period before Shipton's party arrived, and it moved in a direction and at a pace that left a mile of consistent impressions in snow that was cold enough and fresh enough to record them accurately. Ward's insistence throughout his life that the prints showed no signs of distortion at the time of discovery is significant in this context. He was a physician trained to observe physical evidence carefully and to distinguish between what is actually present and what is inferred, and he was specific in his repeated accounts about the condition of the snow at the time the trackway was first encountered. The walls were sharp, the morning was cold, the discovery was fresh. These are not the conditions under which a smaller original impression expands to anomalous dimensions. Those conditions require direct sunlight and elevated temperatures acting on snow for several hours, and the circumstances of the discovery, as Ward described them, did not include those factors at the relevant moment. The Illustrated London News spread has a particular visual quality that can be imagined clearly from a description of it. The paper was printed in London in November 1951, and its pages were large, broadsheet scale, heavy paper stock, the kind of publication that a reader holds open across a lap or spreads on a table rather than folding into one hand. The photograph of the Menlung print occupied a significant portion of the column space allocated to it. The ice axe lay along the lower edge of the print, its wooden shaft running parallel to the ground surface, the metal head extending beyond the print's lower border, and the dimensions of the print's width in relation to the axe's length were clearly readable even in reproduction. In sitting rooms across London, in November, with the cold of the English autumn outside the windows and the warmth of a room inside, readers looked at something that had happened above the snow line in Nepal weeks earlier, something that had no explanation attached to it and had arrived in their hands with its question intact and open. The expedition's primary purpose, the mapping of Nepal's southern approaches to Everest, was not obscured or forgotten by the discovery. Shipton's party continued its reconnaissance work. The survey they were conducting in preparation for a future summit attempt remained the official reason for their presence in that part of Nepal, and the practical mountaineering work of the expedition proceeded around and after the Menlung discovery without any fundamental disruption. Shipton was not a man whose attention was easily diverted from the technical tasks at hand. The documentation of the prints was thorough and careful, but it was also, in a sense, subordinate to the expedition's larger purpose, conducted in the course of a day's work rather than as the expedition's central goal. This is part of what gives the discovery its particular character in the historical record. It was made, as many such finds are made, incidentally, by people whose attention was focused elsewhere, and who paused to document what they found before continuing with the work they had come to do. The photograph that Shipton took on the Menlung Glacier in 1951 survives in archives accessible to researchers, and its quality is sufficient to allow photogrammetric analysis of the print's dimensions using the ice axe as a reference measure. The image is not ambiguous in its main subject. The print is clearly an impression in snow. The walls are clearly visible. The ice axe is clearly present as a scale reference. The relative dimensions of print and axe are clearly legible. What the image does not contain is any indication of what made the print. The track from which it was taken continued for approximately 1 mile and ended on bare ice. The snow of the Menlung Basin surrounding the trackway was otherwise unmarked. In the time since its publication, the photograph has been examined by people who argue that the print was made by a known animal, a bear perhaps, or a snow leopard, or some other species whose tracks might be distorted and enlarged by high-altitude solar sublimation, and by people who argue that no known animal could account for the combination of size, shape, and bipedal stride pattern the trackway presented. Neither argument has achieved the kind of documentary support that would allow a definitive conclusion, and the photograph continues to occupy its position in the evidentiary record as the clearest single documented instance of anomalous high-altitude footprints in the Himalayan region. It is a photograph of something that was in the snow on a glacier in Nepal in November 1951. It is a photograph of something that has never been satisfactorily explained. Michael Ward, in the accounts he gave throughout his life, was consistent about the conditions and the details of the discovery. And he was also consistent about something more fundamental, that he and Shipton had found what they found, and that what they found was genuinely anomalous by the standards of the evidence available to them at the time, and that the honest thing was to report it accurately and allow subsequent investigation to determine what it meant. He did not claim certainty about the creature that made the prints. He did not offer interpretations that went beyond what the physical evidence supported. He described the snow surface, the sharpness of the walls, the width and the length, the mile of trackway, the disappearance onto bare ice, and he left the accounting for these things to those who might one day have the means to provide it. Shipton's ice axe is a specific and retrievable detail in this history, a particular wooden shafted tool carried up through the Khumbu, laid down in the snow of the Menlung Basin for a specific compositional reason, and then presumably picked up again and carried on. Its role as measuring instrument complete, and its role as working equipment resumed. The print beside it in the photograph was 33 centimeters long and 20 centimeters wide, and still held the shape of whatever had pressed down through the snow surface in the cold air above the permanent snow line of northeastern Nepal. The glacier around both of them was pale and still under the November morning light, the walls of the cirque closing in on 3 sides, the Menlung La above and behind them on the border between Nepal and Tibet. The question that Shipton's photograph carries has not, in the decades since its publication, been answered. This is not for any lack of effort or any absence of analytical attention, or any failure of the many careful people who have brought whatever tools and methods were available to them to bear on the evidentiary record. The prints were found, they were documented, they were measured, they were photographed with a built-in scale reference. The photograph was published and reproduced and analyzed and argued about across 7 decades of increasing scientific capacity. The trackway on the Menlung Glacier followed its mile of consistent impressions to the bare ice and ended there, and the image of the ice axe in the snow beside the print, the axe's wooden shaft cold and still, the print's walls clean in the November morning air, the surrounding glacier unmarked and pale and wide, has remained in the evidentiary record exactly as Shipton left it, a documented fact about something that was present in the Menlung Basin in 1951, waiting with neither urgency nor impatience for an account that has not yet arrived. In the sitting rooms of November 1951, across London and across the wider world that received the image in the weeks following its publication in the Illustrated London News, readers looked at the photograph of the print and the ice axe and the pale snow of the Menlung Glacier and found themselves in possession of something that their ordinary categories of knowledge did not readily absorb. The photograph was real, the photographer was named and credible and present, the location was specific, the scale reference was built into the image in a form that allowed independent verification, and none of these anchoring certainties resolved the central question, not for those first readers in 1951, and not for anyone who has examined the image in the decades since. The case file, to use a convenient way of speaking about it, has been open since November 1951. It was opened on a glacier in the Rollwalling Himmel by a mountaineer and a physician who documented what they found with the careful and methodical attention their training had given them. And it was opened further into the world by a newspaper in London and the presses of a dozen countries that reproduced the image in the weeks that followed. It rests now, as it has always rested, on a single clear photograph, the ice axe lying in the snow on the Menlung Glacier, the print beside it, the walls of the impression still holding their shape in the cold November air of 1951, the surrounding snowfield pale and still, and otherwise unmarked. The photograph has never been explained. The ice axe remains in the image, and the print remains exactly as Shipton found it and left it, 33 centimeters long, its questions still open, held quietly in the high white light of a place very far from any sitting room where anyone has ever looked at it and wondered. At 5,716 meters, the Nangpa La is not a place that announces itself. The pass arrives gradually, the gradient easing, the wind shifting direction, the last rocky scramble opening onto a narrow saddle of wind-scoured stone and packed snow that sits between Nepal and Tibet like a threshold worn smooth by generations of use in early morning before the sun has fully cleared the ridgelines to the east. The surface of the pass holds a particular quality of light, gray-white, diffuse, catching the shallow angles of old compression in the snow rather than the bright flat glare that the midday sun will bring. Standing on the Nangpa La at that hour, the Tibetan plateau is visible to the north as a pale, enormous absence, a vast tilted plain of air and distance that seems to begin just beyond the final stone of the pass and extend without interruption toward the edge of sight. The snow on the surface of the pass, in that early light, carries a record of everything that has crossed it, not in the sense of any single clear track, but in the layered, compressed, overlapping way of a surface used for a very long time by a very great many things. Sherpa traders and their yak trains, Tibetan merchants carrying salt and wool, pilgrims, seasonal migrants following the old routes between the plateau above and the valleys far below. The impressions of all of these crossings do not survive individually. They compress and merge and are buried under fresh snowfall and then exposed again by wind. And what remains is not a record of any specific passage, but the denser, harder surface that centuries of foot traffic produces in a high-altitude snowfield. The Nangpa La has been in use for as long as there have been people living in the valleys on both sides of it, and the evidence of that use is written into the texture of the snow underfoot, rather than in any single legible trace. The Nangpa La sits above the Khumbu Glacier at the northern end of the Khumbu region of northeastern Nepal, a landscape defined by the Dudh Kosi River system, by the great glacial valleys that drain southward from the Nepal-Tibet border ridge, and by the particular character of high-altitude terrain that lies above the permanent snow line, but below the extreme elevation zones where sustained human presence becomes impossible. The Khumbu is bounded to the west by the Rolwalling region, from which it is separated by the Tessi Lapcha Pass, another high crossing, narrow and rocky, flanked by ice on both sides, the two glacial valleys dropping away in opposite directions from its saddle into a silence that carries distant sound, strangely, arriving softened and changed by the time it reaches the ear. Together, the Khumbu and Rolwalling form the geographic core of the region most consistently associated with documented Yeti track discoveries and high-altitude sightings, a zone of some concentrated recurring attention that spans decades of exploration and fieldwork. The Dudh Kosi, the river that drains the Khumbu southward, begins its descent from the glacial cirques above and moves through a landscape that changes character rapidly with elevation. At the river's upper reaches, near the glacial moraines and the base of the Khumbu icefall, the terrain is open and pale, rock and ice, and the remnant snowfields of the previous winter. Lower, the valley walls close in, the rhododendron and birch begin. The air thickens slightly with moisture, and the world shifts register. But the zone that concerns the record of Yeti reports most directly is the high intermediate band, the rough elevation corridor between approximately 506,100 meters above sea level, where alpine meadow gives way to permanent glacial ice, and where the last known large primates would be operating at the absolute upper edge of their plausible range. This band straddles the transition between the inhabited and the uninhabitable in a particular way, high enough to be genuinely remote from sustained human presence, low enough that the terrain is not yet the sealed, vertical, technically demanding environment of the upper mountain. It is a zone of snow and open stone and winter silence crossed by a relatively small number of routes, and the documented record of anomalous footprint discoveries is concentrated within it. The tree line in this part of Nepal gives way at roughly 4,000 to 4,500 meters, depending on aspect and shelter. Below it, the forests of fir and rhododendron and birch create a dense enclosed environment, a layered world of bark and shadow and rotting wood, where animals move without leaving consistent traces on any surface that holds them long. Above it, the character of the terrain changes entirely. The last dwarf rhododendron scrub trails off into open rock, and beyond that the snow begins, and beyond the snow the glacial ice, and above the ice the high ridgelines. The transition from vegetated slope to open high-altitude terrain is clear and abrupt in the way that such transitions always are in mountain environments. A visible line, a shift in color and texture, the sudden opening of a landscape that had been enclosed. It is above this line that the documented footprint record clusters, and it is this concentration that has made the high-altitude geography of the Khumbu and Rolwalling regions central to any serious engagement with the evidentiary record. Sagarmatha National Park, established in 1976 and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in recognition of both its ecological significance and its cultural landscape, encompasses much of the Khumbu region, the Everest Massif and its surrounding glacial systems, the Sherpa villages, and ancient trade routes. The high altitude zones above the tree line, where the terrain transitions from human scale to something wider and older and less accommodating of presence. The park's designation has not changed the terrain itself, but it has formalized a kind of attention, scientific, conservational, institutional, that now operates in the same zones where expedition reports and indigenous accounts have accumulated over the better part of a century. The Rolwalling region, lying immediately to the west, holds its own protected areas and its own deep history of traversal, with routes crossing the Tessie Lapsha, connecting it to the Khumbu in the east, and older paths descending westward toward the Galu Shankar Massif and its glacial systems. It is within these established geographic boundaries that the physical environment most relevant to the Yeti record exists. The terrain is neither featureless nor arbitrary. The glaciers have names. The passes have been used for specific historic purposes by specific peoples. The elevation zones have measurable climatic characteristics, and the snowfields of the high intermediate zone have a particular, well-documented property that is central to any honest analysis of anomalous footprint discoveries. They do not hold a print in its original form for very long. Solar radiation at high altitude is intense in a way that is not immediately apparent to someone whose intuitions about cold and sunlight are formed at lower elevations. The thin atmosphere at 5,000 or 6,000 meters provides relatively little filtration of incoming radiation, and clear sky conditions at those elevations, which are common during the pre-monsoon and post-monsoon expedition seasons, produce direct solar radiation that acts on snow surfaces rapidly and powerfully. The process is sublimation and surface melting, and it is glaciologically well documented. Snow crystals at the edges of an impression absorb radiation, begin to sublimate and melt, and flow or collapse inward, widening the original footprint impression. Under clear sky conditions, a fresh footprint's width can increase by 50 to 100% within 4 to 6 hours of exposure to direct high-altitude sunlight. The original shape of the foot that made it becomes increasingly difficult to read as the morning progresses. What was a clear impression at 6 in the morning may be an enlarged, softened, rounded depression by noon, wider, shallower, its original margin obscured. A fresh print in high-altitude snow at sunrise has walls that are still sharp, the compressed snow of the interior sitting cleanly against the untouched surface snow of the surrounding field, the line between them crisp enough to cast a narrow shadow in the low morning light. By 4 hours into direct sun, those walls have rounded and retreated. The impression is larger in all horizontal dimensions and shallower in depth. Its interior surface, if it was once distinct enough to carry details of individual toe impressions or surface texture, has smoothed. It remains legible as a footprint or as an impression of some weight-bearing passage, but the specific dimensions of the original foot are no longer recoverable from it with confidence. This is not a rare or exceptional process. It is ordinary glaciology, operating in all high-altitude snowfields under predictable solar conditions. It is also the mechanism most frequently invoked by scientific analysts when discussing how a track made by a known animal, a bear, a wolf, a human wearing boots, might, by the time it was encountered and photographed by an expedition party hours later, appear to have dimensions that no member of that species could plausibly produce. The Nang Pala, precisely because it has been a working trade crossing for so long, offers a particular kind of lens for thinking about the high-altitude terrain and the record it holds. Centuries of human and animal foot traffic, traders, yaks, pilgrims, porters, have moved across these zones, leaving and losing their traces in the seasonal snowfall and the ablation of summer. The routes they used were practical routes, the best angles, the safest gradients, the crossings least exposed to avalanche or weather. These same routes were the routes that Himalayan wildlife used and continued to use. The passes and the high traverses that connected one glacial valley with another were used by bear, wolf, snow leopard, and the large ungulates of the high alpine zone in the same way they were used by the traders who preceded the European expeditions by many generations. The tracks of all of these passages accumulated in the snow were buried, were revealed, were altered by sun and wind and the differential settlement of snow under its own weight. When the first Western expeditions began crossing these same passes in the 1920s and 1930s, they were moving through terrain that had been traversed regularly for a long time by many things. They were also moving through it with a particular kind of attention, the attention of explorers who were documenting everything, who were operating with scientific frameworks and expedition field journals and photographic equipment, and who were primed by altitude and remoteness to find what they found genuinely remarkable. The prints they encountered were remarkable. The fact that the same high-altitude zones have produced consistent reports across decades and from independent observers in separate parts of the Himalayan arc is a feature of the evidentiary record that geographical context helps to understand rather than to dismiss. The terrain created the conditions. The terrain also preserved, partially, temporarily, imperfectly, whatever left the traces. The Khumbu Glacier is the largest glacier in Nepal and one of the most extensively documented glacial systems in the Himalaya. It descends from the western Wum, the high glacial basin between Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse, through the chaotic, sericed, heavily crevassed Khumbu icefall, and then extends southward in a long, debris-covered tongue of ice to its terminus at roughly 4,900 meters near the village of Labuche. Its surface below the icefall is heavily covered with moraine, rock debris, carried down from the surrounding ridgelines and deposited on the glacier's surface over decades and centuries, insulating the ice beneath and giving the lower Khumbu Glacier the gray-brown, rubble-strewn appearance of a wide, slow river of rock. Above the icefall, the glacier is cleaner, open snow and ice at elevations where the crevasse fields and the seracs create a fractured labyrinthine landscape of blue-white ice walls and deep internal shadows. This is the zone through which the 1953 route to Everest passed, the route that had been crossed and recrossed by expedition parties since the early reconnaissance efforts of the preceding decades, and it is the broader system within which the Nangpa La trade route operated at its upper end. To the west of the Khumbu, across the Tessi Lapcha, the Rolwalling region holds its own glacial system centered on the Menlung and Rapimo glaciers, which drain southward from the Nepal-Tibet border ridge into the enclosed Rolwalling Valley. The Menlung Glacier occupies a cirque, a high, amphitheater-shaped glacial basin that sits above the Rolwalling River at elevations between roughly 5,200 and 6,200 meters, and it is one of the most remote glacial environments in the central Himalaya, with limited access from any direction and virtually no regular human foot traffic at its upper reaches. The Menlung Basin's enclosure, The way its high ridgelines contain the interior of the cirque and reduce the intrusion of wind and sound gives it a particular character of stillness at its interior. Distant sound arrives there softened and slow, as though it has had to travel through more air than the actual distance would suggest. The basin's remoteness means that the snow surface at its interior, away from the moraine edges and the ice margins, tends to hold whatever has crossed it in a more legible state and for a longer period than the more wind-exposed surfaces of the higher passes. The Gauri Shankar Massif, whose western flanks contain the upper Roll-Walling drainage, rises above this enclosed cirque world on the Nepal-Tibet border and provides the visual backdrop for the Menlung Basin. Its ridgelines, running northeast to southwest, form the skyline above the glacier and mark the boundary between the Nepali drainages and the Tibetan Plateau. The Menlung La, the pass at the head of the Menlung Glacier that connects the Roll-Walling drainage to the Tibetan side. Anna sits on this border ridge at an elevation that places it firmly above the permanent snow line, a narrow saddle of wind-scoured rock with the Tibetan Plateau visible to the north as the same vast pale expanse that is visible from the Nungpa La, the same enormous distance of elevated flatland that has for centuries been the other side of the Himalayan frontier. The third focal point of the documented record sits far to the east in a different part of the Himalayan arc entirely. The Menlung Glacier descends through the Kangchenjunga region on the Nepal-Sikkim border, a long tongue of gray-white ice moving through a valley flanked by Kangchenjunga's subsidiary ridges, its surface marked by the parallel lines of old crevasses that heal under seasonal snowfall and reopen in summer, the lateral moraines along its edges carrying the accumulated rock debris of thousands of years of glacial transport. The Menlung is one of the largest glaciers in the eastern Himalaya, and it drains a mountain system, Kangchenjunga, at 8,586 meters, is the world's third highest peak that is geographically and culturally distinct from the Khumbu and Roll-Walling environments to its west. The documented Yeti-associated reports from the Menlung Glacier region date back to the 1920s and 1930s, emerging from the same period of peak European expedition activity in the eastern Himalaya that produced the Khumbu reports, and they share with those reports the character of careful, field note accounts from experienced mountaineers operating in terrain that they knew well by the standards of their time. The separation between these three focal points is considerable. From the Khumbu Glacier to the Menlung Glacier, measured along the Himalayan arc, is roughly 400 kilometers of mountain terrain. From the Menlung Glacier in Roll-Walling to the Menlung, the distance is comparable. These are not adjacent localities. They are not even closely neighboring mountain ranges. They are distinct systems, separated by other massifs and other glacial valleys and other cultural zones, and the fact that the documented record of anomalous high-altitude footprint discoveries and credible sighting accounts clusters around all three of them independently across multiple decades is a feature of the geographic record that any honest mapping of the phenomenon must acknowledge. The accounts do not cross-reference one another. The expeditions that produced the Khumbu reports were different expeditions from those that produced the Sikkim reports. The Roll-Walling accounts come from a different set of observers again, and from terrain that sees far less Western expedition traffic than the Khumbu. What they share is the elevation band, the terrain type, and the character of the snowfields in which the tracks were found. The elevation band itself, that 4,500 to 6,100 meter corridor, is not arbitrary. Below 4,500 meters, the terrain becomes forested and vegetated, and the snowfields are seasonal and often patchy. the surface conditions less consistently favorable for the preservation of clear impressions over the hours or days that might elapse before an expedition party reaches a given location. Above 6,100 meters, the terrain shifts register entirely. The snowfields become the near vertical face ice and the exposed ridge snow of the extreme upper mountain, a zone in which sustained biological activity of any large mammal becomes implausible on any extended basis, and in which the documented accounts of anomalous tracks are far rarer and less consistent. The high intermediate zone between these two boundaries is the zone where the terrain is open enough to carry trackways across snowfields of meaningful length, remote enough to have seen limited regular human traffic, and at the right elevation for the solar sublimation process to operate in ways that are measurable and predictable. It is, in other words, the zone where the evidentiary conditions for producing the kind of anomalous trackway record that the documented accounts describe are most reliably met. The geography did not guarantee any particular outcome. It provided the physical conditions within which the record accumulated. Within this zone, the high passes are the critical nodes, the points where the terrain is crossed, where routes converge, where the compressed snow of a well-used saddle gives way to the open snowfield of the glacier beyond, and where the morning light catches whatever has moved across the surface in the preceding hours at the angle most favorable for the preservation of impressions. The Nangpa La is one such node. The Tessilapcha is another. The Menlung La is a third. These are places where the trackway record, when it exists, is most legible, where the snow is neither too hard nor too soft, neither too exposed to wind nor too sheltered from the cold that keeps the surface firm, and where the light in the early morning hours falls at an angle that makes an impression in the snow visible from a considerable distance. The Nangpa La in early morning holds this quality particularly clearly. Its surface, worn hard by generations of use and then refreshed by seasonal snowfall, sits at exactly the elevation and exposure where early morning snow conditions in the pre-monsoon season are at their most stable and most favorable for track preservation. The wind that scours the pass at other hours has often died by the coldest pre-dawn period, and whatever has moved across the saddle in the night or the early morning leaves its trace in a surface that is firm enough to take a clean impression and cold enough to hold it until the sun arrives. When the sun does arrive, it arrives quickly at this elevation and this exposure. The pass is broad and open, with no sheltering ridgeline to the east to extend the shadow, and the sublimation process begins almost immediately after the surface is lit. By mid-morning, the morning's traces are already beginning to change. There is also the question of what the terrain channels and what it disperses. A glacial cirque like the Menlung Basin is enclosed in a way that tends to concentrate the movement of large animals at predictable crossing points, the glacier margins, the moraine edges, the few routes that descend from the surrounding ridgelines without requiring technical climbing. A large, heavy animal moving through such terrain in winter or early spring, when the snowpack is deep and the surface is consistent across the basin floor, would leave a trackway that is readable for some time at the relatively protected interior of the basin, longer than a similar trackway on a more exposed and wind-worked surface. The basin's enclosure also means that the trackway would remain undisturbed by any traffic other than the animal's own passage, in a way that is less reliably true of the high passes, where both human and animal movement is concentrated and overlapping. The Rowalling Valley below the Menlung Basin is one of the more remote inhabited valleys in the Nepali Himalaya. It runs east-west, draining toward the Tamakoshi River to the southwest, and it has historically been home to a small population of Sherpa and related communities whose villages, Bedding and Na, are the principal ones, are among the highest permanently occupied settlements in the region. The valley's relative isolation has meant that it has seen less of the sustained expedition and trekking traffic that the Khumbu has received since the 1950s, and the high-altitude terrain above the valley, the Roll Walling and Menlung glaciers, and the surrounding ridgelines has remained among the least visited glacial environments of the central Himalayan zone in which the Yeti record is concentrated. This remoteness is itself a characteristic of the terrain that the geographic record must hold accurately. The accounts that emerge from this environment come from parties that had limited or no prior access to it, crossing it at points where human presence was genuinely sparse in the days and weeks preceding their arrival. The same quality of remoteness applies, with different particulars, to the Zemu Glacier region in Sikkim. The Kangchenjunga Massif and its surrounding high-altitude terrain were explored by Western expeditions beginning in the late 19th century, but the approaches to the mountain's glacial systems involve long approaches through terrain that limits regular access, and the Zemu's upper reaches have seen relatively little traffic outside the period of active expedition work in the 1920s and 1930s, when the earliest documented reports from that area were produced. The geography of the Zemu, its length, the enclosure of the valley, the lateral moraines that flank its edges, gives it some of the same character of contained, self-contained high-altitude remoteness that characterizes the Menlong Basin, a snowfield environment above the tree line, below the extreme upper mountain, through which something large and heavy would leave legible traces on the right surface at the right hour of day. A wide map of the Himalayan arc, drawn with these three focal points marked on it, shows something that is worth holding its scale for a moment. The Everest Massif and its Khumbu Glacier, with the Nengpa La above it, sits toward the right of the central Himalayan section. The Gauri Shankar Massif and the Menlung Glacier in the Rold Walling region sits a short distance to the west, separated from the Khumbu by the Tesi Lapsha crossing. The Zemu Glacier beneath Kangchenjunga sits far to the east, well into the section of the arc that has always been geographically and politically distinct from the central Nepal Himalaya. Between these 3 points the arc continues, other massifs, other glacial systems, other passes and high valleys, but the documented record of consistent, independent, credible accounts of anomalous high-altitude tracks clusters most densely at these 3 locations, and has done so since the 1920s. What this map describes is not a small and localized curiosity, but a persistent pattern distributed across a significant portion of the world's highest mountain range. The reports do not cluster in one valley or around one expedition route. They emerge from 3 distinct focal points, separated by enough geographic distance that the observers involved in each could not have been influenced by proximity to one another's accounts, and they share the characteristic of consistent high-altitude concentration in the same elevation band, in the same terrain type, in the same seasonal conditions of snow and light. The map holds these 3 names at a quiet and open distance from one another: the Khumbu Glacier, the Menlung Glacier in Roll Walling, the Zemu Glacier beneath Kangchenjunga, and the thread that connects them is not drawn as a line on any chart. It persists in the record itself, in the accumulated weight of independent accounts from geographically separate locations that describe, across decades, the same narrow band of high-altitude terrain, the same condition of a large and unidentified impression in the snow, the same morning light on the same kind of surface, the same moment of arriving at a trackway that leads across the snowfield toward the far edge of the glacier and disappears onto harder ice. 3 distant places 3 separate records, and between them an unresolved pattern that the geography of the Himalayan arc holds quietly, as it has held everything that has moved across it, without announcing what it means. On the Lac Prélat in September 1921, the snow lay undisturbed at approximately 6,900 meters, white and hard-packed under high-altitude light that flattened shadow and made distances difficult to read. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Howard Barry's party was crossing the pass as part of the first official British reconnaissance of Everest's approaches, mapping terrain that most Western cartographers had never walked. The Sherpa porters moving with the expedition noticed them first. A line of large dark impressions moved across the snow at an angle to the party's route, widely spaced, each one sunk cleanly into the surface, the trackway running from somewhere above the visible crest of the pass down toward the far snowfield until it curved out of sight. Howard Barry noted the prints in his expedition journal. He measured them as best the conditions allowed and recorded them as anomalous. Neither the shape nor the spacing matched any animal he had observed on the lower approaches to the mountain. The Sherpa porters who examined the prints identified them without hesitation, using the term meadow kangmi, a compound phrase from their dialect that carried the sense of a filthy or wild man creature of the snows, a being their communities had named and discussed for generations before any Western expedition arrived. Howard Barry's account of the prints and his record of the Sherpa identification reached the press through a Calcutta correspondent named Henry Newman, who encountered the term Met-o Kangmi and rendered it in English as the abominable snowman. The phrase was vivid, and it spread. It would anchor English language coverage of the subject for 3 full decades, carrying with it a dramatic register that the original Sherpa term had not possessed. The tracks on the Lac Bala were not the first anomalous prints recorded in the high Himalaya, and they were not the last. What makes the 1921 account useful as an anchor for the wider record is its precision. Howard Barry was a careful observer. His Sherpa porters were experienced high-altitude travelers with detailed knowledge of the terrain and its fauna, and the junction between their 2 different framings of the same set of prints, one seeking a naturalistic explanation, the other applying an existing indigenous category with confidence, captures something that would recur across the following decades of documentation. The same prints, the same location, 2 separate systems of knowledge arriving at different descriptions. 4 years later, in 1925, a Royal Geographical Society fellow named N.A. Tombazi was traveling near the Menlung Glacier in Sikkim at an elevation of approximately 4,267 meters when members of his party drew his attention to a figure visible on a snowfield some distance away. Tombazi raised his binoculars. The figure was approximately 270 meters distant, moving upright across the slope, erect, bipedal, dark against the white surface of the snow. He watched it for perhaps a minute. It appeared to pause at the far edge of the snowfield, near a growth of low scrub, pulling at the vegetation or the branches above the snow line, before it continued moving and passed out of his line of sight, behind a ridge. Tombazi recorded his observation with the care of an experienced natural historian. He noted the figure's upright posture, its dark coloring, its apparent height relative to the vegetation at the snowfield's margin. He noted that it was moving against the gradient of the slope in a manner consistent with a large biped rather than a quadruped. 2 hours later, Tombazi's party reached the location where the figure had been visible. The snowfield still bore the prints. They were arranged in a line consistent with bipedal walking, left and right impressions in an alternating stride pattern. each print measuring between 15 and 18 centimeters in length. Tambazi examined them carefully. He noted the absence of claw marks which he had expected to find if a bear had been responsible. The prints themselves were somewhat indistinct. The snow at that elevation and that hour of the morning had already begun softening under direct high-altitude sun, but their arrangement was clear and their shape was readable. He photographed what he could. The trackway ran to the scrub vegetation at the snowfield's lower margin and then moved onto harder ground, where the impressions became unreadable. Tambazi was not given to dramatic statement. His published account of the sighting is careful, qualified, and thorough. He offered several possible explanations for what he had seen and what his party had found in the snow, and he concluded that none of them satisfactorily accounted for all the observable characteristics. He did not claim to have seen an unknown creature. He recorded an observation, measured the physical evidence it left behind, and noted that the question of its origin remained open. His account reads today, much as it read in 1925, the record of a trained observer who found something that did not resolve cleanly into any available category and had the discipline to say so precisely. The Bayandar Valley in what is now Uttarakhand state in India rises into the Garhwal Himalaya east of the Nanda Devi Massif, its glaciers draining southward through a landscape of high rock and seasonal snow. In the summer of 1937, British mountaineer Frank Smythe was working through the valley on an extended botanical and mountaineering expedition, the trip that would produce his 1938 book, The Valley of Flowers. Smythe was an experienced high-altitude traveler who had participated in multiple Everest attempts and was familiar with the range of wildlife found at various elevations in the western Himalaya. On a glacier in the upper valley, at elevation, he came across a trackway that stopped him. The prints were large. He measured them at approximately 30 centimeters in length, and they were arranged in a bipedal pattern. Each impression sunk several centimeters into the snow surface, the spacing between them consistent with the stride of a large upright animal. Smythe had observed bear tracks on the lower slopes of the valley during the same expedition, and he examined these prints against that reference point. The differences were apparent. The shape of the prints he now stood among was not consistent with the forepaw or hindpaw impressions he had seen lower down. The forward edge of each impression showed no sign of claw marks. The pattern of the stride was not the quadrupedal overprint he had seen in bear tracks below, the movement that tends to produce the visually confusing large compound prints that have, in many cases, explained anomalous track discoveries at lower elevations. Smythe photographed the trackway and included the images in the Valley of Flowers, with a brief, careful account that presented the prints and his observations without reaching a firm conclusion about their origin. What Smythe published in 1938 was not a sensational claim. It was a set of field photographs and a short, technically grounded description of an anomaly that had appeared in a book primarily concerned with Himalayan botany, and the aesthetic experience of the high mountain environment gives it a particular quality. The prints are documented in a context where no one was looking for them and no one had a professional interest in finding them. The same quality, the absence of prior expectation or vested interest, characterizes many of the most useful entries in the wider record. The decades following the Second World War brought a new intensity of Western presence in the Nepal Himalaya. Everest expeditions became increasingly organized and well-funded. The mountain was climbed in 1953. The political opening of Nepal to foreign expeditions created sustained traffic through regions that had previously seen only Sherpa and Tibetan traders, and the occasional British surveyor. With that traffic came more track discoveries, more witness accounts from experienced mountaineers, and eventually a series of dedicated expeditions specifically intended to investigate the question of what was leaving those prints in the high-altitude snow. Tom Slick was a Texas oilman who had made his money in petroleum and spent a portion of it on the edges of natural history. His interest in anomalous wildlife reports was genuine, and his resources were considerable. In 1957 and again in 1958, Slick funded expeditions to Nepal with the explicit goal of gathering physical evidence for Yeti existence. The operating area was primarily the Arun Valley region of eastern Nepal, a drainage system running south from the Tibet border through terrain that was both remote and, at its lower elevations, inhabited by Sherpa and other communities whose members had accumulated observations over generations. The expeditions worked systematically. They interviewed local witnesses at length, documented footprint trackways with photographs and measurements, and collected biological specimens wherever they could be found. Hair samples, alleged fecal material, any physical residue that might be submitted to laboratory analysis. Among the people working with Tom Slick's expeditions was Peter Byrne, an Irish adventurer and naturalist who had developed a particular expertise in the Himalayan region and who would continue fieldwork on the Yeti question long after Slick's operations concluded. Byrne spent extended periods in the Arun Valley conducting interviews and following up on reported sightings and track discoveries. He was a careful observer and a methodical field researcher, filling notebooks with accounts from witnesses who described encounters with large, dark, bipedal animals at high elevations. Not legends, not second-hand reports, but accounts from men and women who had been above the tree line with their yak herds or moving between settlements and had observed something that did not match any animal they could name. The quality of Byrne's Arun Valley interviews varied, as field interviews always do. Some witnesses were specific and consistent across multiple conversations. Others described experiences that clearly drew on community narratives as much as personal observation. Byrne made careful note of the distinctions. He was interested in the category of witness, who had not sought out the encounter, who had simply been moving through terrain where the encounter happened, and who described it with the matter-of-fact register of someone reporting a weather event, observed, noted, filed, and not particularly alarming in itself, because the communities of the Arun Valley had been living alongside these reports for as long as anyone could remember. The trackways that Byrne documented in the Arun Valley region during the late 1950s followed patterns that were broadly consistent with the prints recorded by Howard Berry on the Lakpala, by Timbazi near the Menlung Glacier, and by Smythe in the Vyandar Valley. The prints tended to appear in the elevation band between roughly 4,500 and 6,000 meters, in terrain that was well above the permanent settlements, but within the range of seasonal herding operations and high-altitude trade routes. They appeared on snow surfaces, glacial ice, seasonal snowfields, the packed neve near passes, rather than on rock or bare ground where impressions would not hold. They were consistently large, consistently bipedal in their arrangement, and consistently showed the characteristic absence of the long claw marks that would identify them as the hindpaw prints of a large bear. This last consistency is worth resting on for a moment, because it is the detail that most experienced observers return to when they were asked what made these particular prints worth noting. Brown bears and black bears are present at various elevations throughout the Himalayan range. Their tracks are documented, their behavior is understood, and their prints at lower elevations are regularly misidentified by inexperienced observers. But the pattern of a bear's gait, the way it places its hind paw, Into or near the depression left by its forepaw, the resulting large compound print produces a distinctive shape, and the claws leave marks that are specific and consistent. The prints documented by Tombazi, Smythe, and the observers working with Slick's expeditions in the late 1950s shared a morphology that did not fit this pattern. That negative characteristic, the absence of claw marks, does not establish what made the prints. It establishes only what, by the evidence, probably did not. Byrne became most publicly associated with an episode that occurred in 1959 when Tom Slick's expeditions were winding down and the question of physical evidence had become pressing. At the Pengbosch Monastery in the Khumbu, at an elevation of approximately 3,901 meters, there was kept a relic, an articulated hand, described as belonging to a Yeti, stored in a wooden box in a small room off the main prayer hall. The monastery's custodians had possessed it for as long as the older monks could recall, and it was shown to visitors with the quiet confidence of an institution that had no doubt about what it held. Byrne was permitted to examine it. The hand was articulated, individual bones connected by desiccated tissue, and its morphology was unusual enough that Byrne arranged to have a finger bone removed for scientific analysis. This was done without the explicit knowledge of the monastery's custodians, a fact that Byrne later acknowledged directly and without evasion. The substitution of a human finger bone for the one removed was intended to preserve the integrity of the relic. The removed bone reached primatologist William Osman Hill at the Zoological Society of London. The context of the Pengbosch hand is recorded here as Byrne documented it. The monastery, the altitude, the relic's apparent age, the physical examination, the removal, and the analysis that followed. What Hill's examination found, and what subsequent genetic analysis produced from material attributed to the hand, belongs to the forensic record. What belongs here is the simpler observation that in 1959, in a stone monastery at 3,901 meters in the Khumbu, there existed an artifact whose custodians had maintained for generations, without any apparent commercial or performative motive, as the physical remains of a creature their community had named and described in considerable detail. That the artifact existed is documented. That the monastery held it with evident sincerity is documented. What it was is a separate question. Through all of the fieldwork conducted in Nepal and Sikkim and Garhwal between 1921 and the end of the 1950s, a particular pattern of consistency runs. The witnesses are from different national backgrounds, different professional disciplines, different decades, and different regions of the Himalayan arc. Howard Bury, in 1921, was a British military officer and geographer. Tombazi, in 1925, was a Greek-British merchant and RGS fellow. Smythe, in 1937, was a mountaineer and writer. The Slick expedition personnel in the late 1950s included a mix of American and British professionals and Sherpa field researchers. None of these observers knew each other's accounts in any systematic way, and several were operating in regions separated by hundreds of kilometers. The Menlung Glacier beneath Kangchenjunga on the Nepal-Sikkim border, and the Bajondar Valley Glacier in Garhwal to the west, and the Khumbu glaciers near Everest to the east are not adjacent terrain. They are separate mountain environments, each with their own climatic character and ecological profile. What the accounts share is structural. Prints found in the elevation band between 4,000 and 6,000 meters, bipedal arrangement, large dimensions, absence of claw marks. A trackway that begins in the snow continues across it in a consistent stride pattern and ends where the snow gives way to harder ground. The figures seen by Tombazi near the Zemu Glacier was observed at a distance too great for fine detail, but what he noted, upright posture, dark coloring, bipedal movement, places it in the same rough descriptive category as the creature described in Sherpa, oral tradition, and referenced in the accounts of Sherpa porters, like those who named the prints on the Hukbala for Howard Bury. That consistency across independent accounts and separated regions does not establish what was making the prints or what Timbazi observed on the snowfield in 1925. What it establishes is that the reports are genuinely independent, that they share characteristics without apparent coordination, and that the observers who left them were experienced enough in the relevant terrain that simple misidentification of common wildlife does not account for every case in the record without remainder. In the lower stretches of the Arun Valley, during Burns' fieldwork, the witnesses he spoke with described the creature with a specificity that reflected long familiarity. They described a large, powerfully built animal with dark reddish-brown or black fur, moving habitually on two legs, most often seen in the early morning or at dusk at elevations above the permanent settlements, observed crossing open snowfields or moving along the margins of glacial ice. They described it without drama, much as a farmer in a temperate country might describe the presence of wolves in the surrounding hills, as a feature of the landscape, observed regularly enough to have accumulated a body of detail, not welcome in the herding areas, but not particularly mysterious in the sense of being outside any available category of explanation. These communities had a category for what they had seen. They had been placing observations into it for generations. The inquiry that Byrne and the Slick expeditions were conducting was, from the perspective of his Arun Valley informants, not an investigation into an unknown entity. It was a belated external interest in something they had long since named. The fieldwork notebooks from the Slick expeditions, the photographs of trackways, the hair samples and other biological material collected from reported encounter sites, all of it formed an accumulating archive through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. The specimens were submitted to laboratories in the United States and the United Kingdom. The results of that analysis, specific and documented, belong to the laboratory record. What belongs to the field record is the effort itself, the months of altitude, the extended interviews conducted through interpreters in stone-floored rooms in high Khumbu villages, the early starts across glacial ice, following fresh impressions before the day's sun softened their walls, the careful measurements and the compass headings, and the photographs taken in thin, cold air. Peter Byrne left the Arun Valley with notebooks full of this material. He maintained his interest in the question for the rest of his professional life. The organized, funded phase of Western investigation that the Slick expeditions represented did not produce a definitive resolution, and Byrne said so plainly in his later accounts of the work. The investigation had produced an archive. It had produced a detailed and internally consistent body of witness testimony from a community of people whose knowledge of the terrain was both ancient and precise. It had produced biological specimens for laboratory analysis. It had produced measurements and photographs of prints that the available explanations did not account for completely. What it had not produced was a single photograph of the animal itself or a specimen of sufficient biological completeness to allow unambiguous identification. This absence is itself part of the documented record. The terrain is extreme, the elevation severe, and the animal, whatever it is, appears to move through a zone where sustained human observation is physiologically demanding and logistically difficult. The same high-altitude remoteness that most has kept the Khumbu and the Arun Valley and the approaches to Kangchenjunga, free of extensive human settlement for most of human history, is also the condition that makes direct observation of whatever is leaving those prints difficult to achieve and difficult to verify. Near the end of the 1950s, as the Slick expeditions concluded their active fieldwork and the archive of reports and specimens passed into the hands of laboratories and analysts, the accumulated record of Western documented encounters with anomalous tracks and figures in the high Himalaya covered just under 4 decades of independent observation. The La Capella in 1921, the Menlung Glacier snowfield in 1925, the Bayandar Valley Glacier in 1937, the Khumbu and the Arun Valley through the 1950s. The observers whose accounts formed this record had not been looking for the same thing across those decades. Howard Bury was mapping terrain. Timbazi was traveling for his own purposes. Smythe was collecting botanical specimens and climbing. Byrne was conducting systematic fieldwork. Their purposes were different. Their locations were spread across a significant arc of the central and eastern Himalaya. The consistency of what they reported across that span of time and that breadth of geography was not the result of coordination. The wide snowfield near the Menlung Glacier where Timbazi stood with his binoculars in 1925, watching the dark upright figure move against the slope. That image rests in the record without resolution. The prints were there when his party reached the location 2 hours later. They measured between 15 and 18 centimeters. They were bipedal. They showed no claw marks. They ran to the margin of the snowfield and ended on harder ground. Timbazi noted all of this and offered his observations to the record he was a part of, a record that had begun gathering accounts before his visit and would continue gathering them long after. The Arun Valley notebooks that Byrne carried out of Nepal were part of the same accumulation, 40 years of careful observers in separated regions, noting the same basic physical anomaly, measuring it where measurement was possible, photographing it where conditions allowed, and describing the encounter with the measured language of people whose training had given them a preference for precision over drama. The interviews Byrne conducted in the Arun Valley added the dimension of sustained community familiarity. Witnesses who had not made a single sighting but had grown up in a landscape where encounters with this animal, or the trace evidence of its presence, were understood as a recurring feature of the high terrain. The record that accumulated between 1921 and the close of the 1950s had not answered the central question: what was leaving those prints in the snow above 4,500 meters across a 400-kilometer arc of the Himalayan range had not been observed clearly enough and documented with sufficient biological specificity to place it unambiguously within any known category. The question had been carefully posed, with considerable precision and from multiple independent angles. The prints in the snow remained what they had always been, a documented physical fact, measured and photographed by experienced observers, whose origin the available explanations had not yet fully accounted for. The investigation was alive, the archive was real, and somewhere above the snow line, in terrain that discouraged sustained human presence, whatever had crossed those glaciers and left those prints in the still cold mornings was continuing its passage through the high places of the world, unobserved and unnamed by science, moving through a landscape that the Sherpa and Tibetan communities of the region had been describing in careful detail for as long as anyone had thought to ask them. The word Yeti arrives from the Sherpa Tibetan, spoken in the high valleys of the Khumbu, as something precise and plainly descriptive. Yete, the rocky place, the animal that belongs there. 2 syllables worn smooth by generations of use, the way any word gets worn when it names something real that people encounter regularly and need a name for. Not a word of fear, not a word of myth, a word of location, of terrain and inhabitant, of the specific creature assigned by long experience to the particular character of a particular kind of ground. The people who made this word have lived at altitudes that most of the world's population will never reach, in valleys that run between the highest mountain massifs on Earth, moving seasonally between lower pastures and high summer grazing land, across passes that sit above 5,000 meters. They have watched the high terrain for many centuries. They have moved through it in every season and in every condition of light and weather. The language they develop to describe it is detailed, graduated, and specific, and the word Yeti is part of that language, not an anomaly within it, not a gesture toward the supernatural, but a term that sits alongside the names for wind directions, snow conditions, glacier crossings, and seasonal passes as part of the working vocabulary of people who need accurate language to move safely through complex and demanding terrain. The variant form Mete carries a different shade of meaning in some of the Sherpa and Tibetan dialects spoken across the Khumbu and Sulu Khumbu districts of northeastern Nepal. Meta reaches towards something like man-bear or man-like creature, a name that already encodes an observation about the creature's appearance or movement, something that reminded those who first applied the term of both a person and a large animal simultaneously. That doubleness is itself a piece of information. It is the kind of description that results from having seen something and needed to account for it in language, and finding that the existing categories did not quite fit, so reaching across two of them to approximate what the eyes had reported. The two terms, Ye-te and Me-te, appearing in different dialects across the same region, attest to a depth of linguistic tradition around this creature that does not belong to something invented recently or borrowed from elsewhere. In the ethnographic and anthropological record of Sherpa culture, what emerges from careful fieldwork is not a single undifferentiated creature encountered everywhere above the tree line, but a classification system of notable precision. 3 distinct Yeti types are named and described in Sherpa oral tradition, each assigned its own elevation range, physical scale, and characteristic behavior. At the uppermost extreme, above 5,000 meters on and near the permanent glaciers, the tradition names the Nyolmo, described as the largest of the 3 forms, powerful enough to take livestock and rarely encountered by humans because it occupies terrain that humans rarely enter. Below it, in the fir and rhododendron forests of the subalpine zone and the open alpine meadows above them, the Rakshi Bampo is described intermediate in scale, moving through a zone that Sherpa herders and traders cross regularly on their seasonal migrations. At the lowest elevation, down toward the upper forest margins, the smaller Thelma is named, the form most likely to be seen at close range, most likely to be described in first-person encounters. This 3-tiered classification, the Nyolmo at the glacier line, the Rakshi Bampo in the forest and meadow zone, the Thelma near the lower trees, has attracted the attention of multiple anthropologists who have noted that it does not resemble a single mythological creature scaled up or down for dramatic purposes. It resembles, instead, the kind of knowledge that accumulates when people with generations of observational experience in a given landscape identify multiple species or multiple populations and give each one a name fitted to its characteristics and its range. Some researchers have proposed that 3 tiers may encode genuine ecological observation of multiple real animal species, whose appearances at certain distances or in certain conditions were interpreted as variations on a single creature type. Whether that is the case or not, the classification system itself is a record of careful, accumulated, differentiated attention to what moves across a very particular landscape at very particular elevations. American anthropologist Sherry Ortner began ethnographic fieldwork among the Khumbu Sherpa in the 1960s, and she returned to the Sherpa community and its relationship with the high Himalayan environment across several decades of scholarship that culminated in works including Sherpas Through Their Rituals, published in 1978, and Life and Death on Mount Everest, published in 1999. What Ortner documented in relation to the Yeti was not simply a set of creature descriptions, but a cultural framework in which encounters with beings of the high terrain carried meaning that was simultaneously ecological and spiritual. In the Sherpa understanding of the landscape she recorded, the high mountains are not empty of significance beyond their physical mass. They are inhabited by presences that include the mountain deities, the spirits of passes and glaciers, and the boundary creatures that move at the threshold between the human world and the domains above and beyond it. The Yeti, in the accounts Ortner collected, occupies precisely that threshold. It is an entity of the edge, found at the upper margin of the terrain. Sherpa people regularly travel at the boundary between the inhabited and the uninhabited world. To encounter it is not straightforwardly a natural event, the way encountering a snow leopard or a Himalayan brown bear might be. It is an encounter at a boundary, and boundaries in Sherpa Buddhist cosmology carry their own weight and their own protocols. Ortner was careful to note that her informants distinguished, with a precision that she found intellectually significant, between personal observation and culturally transmitted belief. A person who had seen something above the tree line would say so in terms that specified the conditions of the sighting, the light, the distance, the clarity of what was seen, and would distinguish carefully between that account and the broader tradition of belief surrounding the creature. That distinction, that fastidious separation of what was personally witnessed from what was received as inherited knowledge, is not the behavior of someone repeating uncritical folklore. It is the behavior of someone who understands the difference between two kinds of evidence and considers it important to keep them separate. What Ortner recorded is a tradition that has been thinking carefully about this creature for a very long time, from the inside, in direct relationship with the terrain it inhabits. The Khumjung Monastery stands in the village of Khumjung in the Khumbu at an elevation of roughly 3,790 meters, with the ridge of the Khumbu Himal rising above it and the path to Namche Bazaar descending below. It is a working monastery, maintained by the local Sherpa community as a site of practice and ceremony, and within it there is kept an artifact that has been described for generations as a Yeti scalp. The object is conical, approximately 25 centimeters in height, covered in coarse reddish-brown fur. It sits in a reliquary within the monastery, tended by custodians who understand it as a significant and ancient possession, connected through the tradition of the monastery to the creature of the high terrain above. The exact age of the scalp's presence at Khumjung is not documented in a way that Western scholarship can date precisely, but it is described in Sherpa tradition as a possession of centuries-long standing, part of the monastery's identity and ceremonial life, in a way that suggests deep integration rather than recent acquisition. Sir Edmund Hillary, in 1960, organized a dedicated expedition with the specific purpose of examining this and other physical artifacts associated with the Yeti tradition, including the scalp at Khumjung. The examination was conducted with the cooperation of the monastery's custodians, who allowed the scalp to be temporarily taken to Kathmandu and then to scientific institutions in the United States and Europe for analysis. Scientists at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago and at the Institut de Paléontologie Humaine in Paris examined the artifact and concluded that it had been fashioned from the skin of a serow, a Himalayan goat antelope, a solid-bodied ungulate that lives in the steep forested terrain below the tree line, shaped over a mold using a traditional craft technique. The scalp was returned to the Kumjung Monastery after examination, and the custodians have since declined further sampling requests. What the scientific examination established and what the monastery's tradition holds are not in direct conflict in the way that a debunking narrative would frame it. The monastery does not require the scalp to be a literal piece of anatomy from an animal encountered on the glacier above. Its cultural role is not that of a forensic specimen. It is a ceremonial object, a tangible anchor for a living tradition, an articulation in physical form of the creature's place in the Sherpa, understanding of the landscape and its inhabitants. The tradition is not falsified by the finding of what material the object is made from, any more than the significance of a religious icon is established or negated by the chemical composition of its pigments. The scalp is interesting as a material artifact and as a cultural object simultaneously, and collapsing one of those registers entirely into the other loses something of the actual texture of what is being described. In the high valleys below Everest, the ceremonial calendar of the Sherpa Buddhist community marks the year with festivals that draw the living practice of Tibetan Buddhism into direct relationship with the specific landscape of the Khumbu. The most significant of these celebrations at the highest elevations is the Mani Rimdu Festival, performed at Tengboche Monastery at 3,867 meters, within sight of the ridgelines of Everest and Ama Dablam, the peaks rising above the monastery walls in a skyline that has remained constant across all the decades of the ceremony's performance. Mani Rimdu is a 3-day festival of masked dances performed in the open courtyard of the monastery, in which monks enact stories of the Buddhist teachings and the defeat of malevolent forces by protective deities. The masks worn by the dancers are painted wooden constructions representing mountain spirits, demons, wrathful protectors, and the wild beings of the high Himalayan environment. Some ethnographers who have documented the Mani Rimdu tradition have identified, among the roster of masked figures in the dance drama, a figure associated with the Yeti, a wild being of the high terrain, neither wholly human nor wholly animal, inhabiting the boundary between the ordered world of human habitation and the vast, undomesticated world of the mountains above. The exact nature of this identification is contested within the ethnographic literature, and it is worth holding carefully. The figure in the dance may represent a class of wild mountain beings, of which the Yeti is one example, rather than the Yeti specifically, as Western popular culture has named it. But the underlying point is the same in either case. The ceremony at Tengboche Monastery includes in its representation of the Khumbu's spiritual landscape a figure from the high terrain, a presence from the world above the monastery walls, given a mask and a place in the ritual order of the community's most important annual celebration. The masked dancers move in the courtyard at Tengboche while the snow peaks rise above them, and the ceremony has been performed year after year across many generations, and whatever figure stands at the boundary between the human world and the mountain world has been given a name, a form, and a role in the living practice of the community long before any Western expedition arrived in the Khumbu to photograph footprints in the snow. There is a specific quality to the way in which the 3-tiered Sherpa classification maps onto the high-altitude terrain of the Khumbu and the regions adjacent to it. The Nyalmo, assigned to the permanent glacier zone above 5,000 meters, inhabits the same elevations at which the documented concentration of large footprint discoveries has occurred. The Rakshi Bampo, placed in the forest and subalpine meadow zone, inhabits the same terrain in which the majority of Sherpa personal encounter accounts have been collected by field workers. The Thelma, smallest and lowest, corresponds roughly to the elevation band at which occasional close-range sightings of bipedal figures have been reported across the wider Himalayan literature. Whether this correspondence reflects the accurate ecological classification of several real animal species or the organization of a consistent mythological tradition around the topography of a known landscape, or something else entirely, it is a correspondence that cannot be dismissed as random. The tradition is not careless about elevation. It is not careless about the particular character of each zone. It has distributed its creature types across the terrain with a precision that matches what is actually known about the physical conditions and the fauna of each band. To treat the Sherpa classification as simple folklore is to misread the relationship between indigenous knowledge traditions and the environments that produce them. Sherpa people did not develop a three-tiered classification of high-altitude creatures from nothing. They developed it from long residence in a landscape of extraordinary vertical complexity, where the transition from lowland forest to permanent glacier happens within a few kilometers of horizontal distance, but across more than 4,000 meters of altitude, and where each band of that transition has its own fauna, its own seasonal patterns, its own character. The people who live inside that landscape and depend on it for survival develop observational traditions that encode genuine information about what they have seen, even when the framework in which that information is encoded is cultural and spiritual rather than scientific in the Western sense of the term. Sherry Ortner's careful attention to the distinction her informants drew between personal observation and inherited tradition is relevant precisely here. Within the three-tiered classification, there is room for both. The larger structure, the framework of three types at three elevations, each with its assigned characteristics, may reflect accumulated cultural knowledge built up over many generations. Within it, individual first-person accounts carry their own evidentiary weight, assessed by the people giving them as exactly that, personal observations from specific moments in specific conditions, offered carefully and distinguished from the broader tradition they are being placed within. The Sherpa engagement with the creature of the high terrain is not monolithic. It is nuanced, contested in small ways between individuals and communities, subject to the normal variation of any living tradition across dialects and villages and generations. Not every Sherpa holds the same view of what the Yeti is, or whether particular accounts represent physical encounters or something else. The tradition is alive in the way living traditions are, not fixed, not uniform, not incapable of doubt or revision. What it is not is recent. What it is not is borrowed from Western expeditionary culture. The language predates the expeditions. The classification predates the expeditions. The ceremony at Tengbuche predates the expeditions. The scalp at Kunjung predates the expeditions. The tradition was already in place, already detailed, already embedded in the ceremonial and linguistic life of the Sherpa community when the first British reconnaissance parties arrived at the high Himalayan passes in the early decades of the 20th century. The Nangpala trade route brought Tibetan and Sherpa traders across the Nepal-Tibet border at 5,716 meters for centuries, carrying salt and grain and wool through the passes that lie above the Khumbu Glacier. Those traders moved through the zones where footprint discoveries were later documented. They moved through them seasonally, regularly in groups that knew the terrain intimately. The creature of the rocky places was already named in the language they spoke before any European climber photographed a print in the snow. The naming did not require a photograph. The naming required the experience of moving through a particular landscape across a sufficient number of generations that the regularities of that landscape, including its inhabitants, acquired language. When Sir Edmund Hillary mounted his 1960 expedition specifically to investigate the Yeti artifacts and gather scientific evidence, the examination took place against the background of this very long tradition, not as an introduction to the subject, but as a late arrival into a conversation that had been underway for many decades before the word Yeti reached the English language press. Hillary's expedition examined the Kumjung scalp, interviewed Sherpa witnesses, and he personally concluded, that the physical artifacts examined could be attributed to known animals. He was public and clear about that conclusion. What his expedition did not examine, and what no expedition has been able to subject to the same kind of material analysis, is the weight of the tradition itself, the depth of its language, the precision of its classification, the integration of the creature into the ceremonial life of communities that have lived in proximity to the high terrain for as long as anyone can document. The scalp at Kumjung was returned to the monastery after the scientists had finished with it. The monastery's custodians received it back and placed it where it had always been, in the reliquary, under the low ceiling of the relic room, in a building that sits at 3,790 meters, with the mountain wall of the Khumbu Himal rising above it. The custodians have declined further sampling requests since that examination, and the monastery continues to function as a working site of practice for the community that maintains it. That is not obstruction. That is the reasonable behavior of a community that has allowed its most significant physical artifact to be taken away, examined, subjected to the conclusions of outside science, and returned, and that has decided, from that experience, that the artifact's role within their tradition does not require further outside verification. The tradition has its own standing. It does not need to be authenticated by laboratories to be real as a tradition, to carry the weight that traditions carry, to encode the knowledge that it has carried for the length of its existence. The word Yeti is still spoken in the Khumbu valleys. It is still part of the working vocabulary of people who move through the high terrain. Children learn it as they learn the names of other creatures of the high landscape, the snow leopard, the Himalayan black bear, the tar. It has not become archaic. It has not been replaced by the English word Yeti, even though the two terms now refer to the same creature in most contexts. The original language persists because the original relationship to the terrain persists. The people who made the word are still there, still moving through the rocky places, still carrying with them the accumulated observation of many generations about what those rocky places contain. There is something worth sitting with in that persistence. The Sherpa classification of Yeti types into 3 elevation bands, each with its own character and range, represents a tradition of careful ecological attention applied across a span of time that far exceeds the Western scientific engagement with the same question. The masked figure at the Mani Rimdu festival, moving in the courtyard of Tengboshe Monastery, while the Khumbu peaks rise above the walls, represents a community's ongoing relationship with the creatures and presences of the landscape it inhabits. The scalp in the Kumjung reliquary, whatever material it is made from, represents a tradition's way of making a boundary creature tangible, of giving it a physical presence within the organized space of human habitation. of acknowledging in ceremonial form what moves in the terrain above. What each of these represents, taken together, is not mystery in the sensational sense. It is knowledge of a specific kind, accumulated, organized, expressed in the language and ceremony available to the people who hold it, pointing consistently towards something that occupies a specific ecological niche at a specific elevation in a specific range of terrain. The Western scientific tradition arrived in the Khumbu with cameras and ice axes, and later with DNA sequencers, and it has produced findings of real value, findings that have clarified some of what the physical evidence does and does not support. But it arrived late. The people who named the creature of the rocky places were already there, already watching, already classifying, already performing the annual ceremony that gives the wild being of the high terrain a mask and a place in the order of the year. The Mani Rimdu festival takes place each year at Tengboche in the 11th month of the Tibetan lunar calendar, typically falling in October or November when the high altitude air has turned cold and the first snow of winter has settled on the upper ridges. The monastery courtyard fills with monks and members of the surrounding community, and the dance drama begins in the clear, thin air at 3,867 meters, and above the walls of the monastery, the summit ridgeline of Everest catches the late afternoon light, and Amadablam stands to the southeast with its characteristic profile, and the ceremony continues as it has continued across many years and many generations of the Sherpa community, who have maintained Tengboche and kept the festival alive. The masked figures move through their choreographed drama in the courtyard. Among them, in the tradition that ethnographers have documented, the wild being of the high terrain takes its place in the order of the ceremony, given a form, given a mask, given a role in the story that the Sherpa Buddhist community tells itself each year about the landscape it inhabits and the beings that share it. The peaks are visible above the monastery walls throughout. The dancer moves, the ceremony continues, and the creature that the Sherpa have been naming and classifying and representing in ceremony since long before the first Western climber arrived at the passes above the Khumbu Glacier has now been the subject of Western scientific investigation for the better part of a century. DNA laboratories have received hair samples and returned results. Forensic analysts have examined bone fragments and offered conclusions. The scientific record has grown year by year with new techniques and new material. All of that work has value, and the findings it has produced are part of what is known about this question. But the Sherpa tradition was already there. It had already been there for a very long time. It had already organized what it knew into language and classification and ceremony. And it continues. The word Yeti is still in the language. The three-tiered classification is still part of the tradition. The Mani Rimdu festival is still performed each year at Tengboche. The scalp at Kumjung is still in the monastery. Whatever moves in the rocky places above the Khumbu valleys, whatever has been seen at distance on the high snowfields, whatever has left its tracks across the glaciers in the cold early morning light, has been known by the people who live closest to it for far longer than any laboratory has been measuring it. The ceremony at Tengboche carries that knowledge in a form that is not forensic, but is also not careless. The dancers move in the courtyard. The peaks stand above the walls. The year turns through its cycle, as it has for as long as the monastery has stood at 3,867 meters, with the great mountains above it and the deep valleys falling away below. The festival continues through the cold November air, the masks moving through the ancient choreography, the high ridgelines holding their snow quietly above, the tradition persisting in the way that deep traditions persist, not because anyone has proven it correct, but because it describes something real about the place it comes from, and the place is still there, and the people are still in it, and the language they made to describe what they found there is still spoken, still precise, still pointed at the high terrain and the creature the terrain contains. In a laboratory at Oxford University in 2013, 36 small tubes arrived for analysis. They had come from many different places: private collectors, natural history museums, research institutions, and each one contained a hair sample that had been attributed, at some point in its history, to a Yeti. Brian Sykes, a human genetics professor at the University of Oxford, who had spent decades developing mitochondrial DNA sequencing techniques for the study of ancient populations, received each tube, logged it, and set it into the sequencing process. The laboratory was quiet and lit for close work. The samples were small. The results arrived over several months, and for most of the 36 samples, the results were what the wider scientific community had anticipated: bear fur, deer hair, wolf, horse, cattle, the animals that share the landscape with anyone moving through the high mountains and sub-Himalayan forests of the region. Most of the samples resolved cleanly into known species. The majority were unremarkable in that respect, and the process moved forward methodically, tube by tube, one sequence at a time. Two of the samples did not resolve cleanly. Two Himalayan samples, one from Ladakh in the far north of India, one from Bhutan, returned a mitochondrial sequence that matched a 40,000-year-old Pleistocene polar bear fossil held in a Norwegian collection. The match was not approximate. It was a close match, and Sykes, a careful scientist with no investment in the Yeti as a phenomenon, acknowledged publicly that he could not immediately account for it within any existing taxonomic framework. The distance between a hair collected in the high Himalaya in the early 21st century and a fossil pulled from a Pleistocene deposit in Norway, some 40,000 years old, was quietly enormous. Sykes proposed one possibility: that the match might indicate the survival or hybridization of a previously undescribed bear lineage in the Himalayas, perhaps a descendant of an ancient polar bear population that had crossed into the Central Asian mountain system during a period of glacial contact. He was careful to frame this as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. The result, he maintained, was what the sequencing had returned. The interpretation remained formally open. Other researchers engaged with the findings critically, and not all of them found the proposed interpretation persuasive. Ross Barnett and colleagues at the University of Copenhagen published a response in 2014 arguing that the two samples' match to the Pleistocene polar bear fossil was more parsimoniously explained by contamination or misidentification, and that the proposed unknown bear hybrid lacked supporting physical evidence in the region. The mitochondrial data Sykes had generated were not in dispute. What the data meant and what had produced it remained a matter of ongoing discussion among the researchers who reviewed the study after publication. The sequence sat in the literature, matched and unassigned. It is worth holding what the Sykes study actually established before moving to what followed it. 34 of 36 samples attributed to Yeti encounters matched known species without significant ambiguity. 2 returned a result that the proposing researcher himself described as preliminary and in need of further work. No sample returned a sequence assignable to an unknown primate. The study did not resolve the Yeti question, and Sykes did not claim that it had. What it produced was a body of molecular data from samples that had circulated for decades in museums, private collections, and research institutions without genetic characterization, and most of that data, when the sequencing was done, pointed clearly toward the bears and ungulates of the Himalayan region. The two anomalous results were real. They were also unverified, and the verification at the time of publication had not been completed. The Pangboche finger bone arrived at the Zoological Society of London by a route that would later be described as unusual. Peter Byrne, conducting fieldwork in the Khumbu region of Nepal during Tom Slick's late 1950s expeditions, had gained access to an articulated hand held at Pangboche Monastery at approximately 3,901 meters in the upper Khumbu Valley. The monastery's custodians had long described the hand as a Yeti relic and its storage conditions in a box within the monastery's relic collection had preserved it in reasonable condition across what appeared to be a considerable period of time. Byrne had removed one of the finger bones from the hand and substituted a human finger bone from another source, a substitution the monastery's custodians may not have been aware of. The original bone reached London. Primatologist William Osman Hill examined the bone at the Zoological Society of London and produced an assessment that those who subsequently reviewed it described as notably cautious. Hill found that the bone's morphology was not definitively assignable to any known species in his judgment, and he noted features that he considered unusual without specifying that they exceeded the range of variation found in either human or known non-human primate populations. He did not conclude that the bone came from an unknown creature. He concluded that it presented questions he could not resolve with the material available to him. His professional assessment, as recorded at the time, left the bone in a state of undetermined taxonomic origin. Subsequent DNA analysis of material attributed to the Pangboche hand, conducted some decades later, returned results consistent with human origin. The interpretation offered by researchers who reviewed that analysis was that the hand had been assembled from human bones, perhaps from a deceased monk or another human source, rather than collected from an unknown animal. This is the current position on the Pangboche hand. In the published scientific literature, the DNA analysis that has been conducted points to human material. The morphological questions Hill noted in 1960 have not generated a separate body of research, and the bone that he examined is no longer accessible for independent verification. What was once an open forensic question has, in the years since, resolved toward a conventional explanation, though the resolution depends on DNA from material whose chain of custody, across several decades, is imperfect. The Kumjung scalp is a different kind of specimen. The conical reddish-brown artifact, approximately 25 centimeters in height, with coarse, stiff fur running in a distinctive pattern across its surface, has been held at Kumjung Monastery in the Upper Khumbu for what the monastery's custodians describe as many generations. Its age as an artifact has not been independently established. In 1960, Sir Edmund Hillary led a dedicated expedition specifically to examine it, and the scalp was brought under agreed conditions to scientific institutions for analysis. The Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago and the Institut de Paléontologie Humaine in Paris both received material for examination. Both institutions concluded that the scalp had been fashioned from the skin of a suro, a Himalayan goat antelope known scientifically as Capricornus sumatraensis, shaped over a mold using a craft technique consistent with the production of ceremonial headwear. The fur pattern, the skin structure, and the shaping technique were all consistent with this conclusion. Later molecular analysis of samples attributed to the scalp also returned ungulate results. The scalp was returned to Kumjung Monastery, where it continues to be held and venerated. The monastery's custodians have since declined requests for further sampling, and the artifact's role within the monastery's tradition has not been altered by the scientific findings produced from its earlier examination. It remains what it has always been to those who care for it, a relic of significance, held carefully within walls that have stood for a long time in the thin air above the Khumbu Valley. There is something precise in that situation that the forensic findings do not fully close. The science identified the material. It did not identify the artifact's origin in time, or the tradition that produced it, or the reason such a thing was made and preserved with such apparent care. Sero skin shaped over a mold is not a random object. It is a made thing with a purpose, and that purpose preceded the scientific examination of it by an unknown number of generations. The analysis established what the material was. The question of what the artifact meant and what the tradition around it preserves was not the kind of question the sequencing was designed to answer. Tom Slick's expeditions of 1957 and 1958 produced biological samples that entered the laboratory record well before the DNA sequencing era made molecular analysis possible. Hair samples, alleged fecal material, and other specimens collected during fieldwork in the Arun Valley of eastern Nepal were submitted to institutions in the United States and United Kingdom for analysis using the techniques available at the time: microscopic comparison of hair shaft morphology, structural characteristics of scale patterns under magnification, comparison against reference collections of known Himalayan species. Some samples returned identifications consistent with known bears or ungulates. Others produced reports in which the examining scientists noted that the sample did not match their reference material without making a firm identification. Those inconclusive reports circulated in the Yeti literature for decades, cited alternately by those who took them as evidence of an anomalous specimen and by those who argued they reflected only the limitations of mid-20th century hair analysis rather than any genuine taxonomic anomaly. The samples themselves, in most cases, are no longer available for re-examination with modern techniques. The 2017 study, published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B by Charlotte Lindquist and colleagues at the University at Buffalo, was, in its design, the most methodologically rigorous examination of alleged Yeti specimens to date. 9 biological samples attributed to Yeti encounters were subjected to whole mitochondrial genome sequencing, a technique that reads the complete mitochondrial genetic sequence rather than the partial segments used in earlier analyses, producing correspondingly higher resolution identification. The samples came from a range of sources: museum collections, monasteries, and private researchers. They included bone fragments, teeth, skin, hair, and fecal material. Each had a documented attribution to a Yeti encounter or to a Yeti relic tradition within a specific institution. The 9 samples were identified as belonging to one of 3 bear species native to the Himalayan and Tibetan Plateau region. The majority were identified as Asian black bear, Ursus thebetanus. 2 were identified as Himalayan brown bear, Ursus arctos isabellinus. 1 was identified as Tibetan brown bear, Ursus arctos pruinosus. The Tibetan brown bear result carried a particular resonance within the established record of Sherpa knowledge. Researchers working on the study noted that the Tibetan brown bear, a critically endangered subspecies, ranging across high elevations of the Tibetan Plateau and surrounding mountain systems, known to prey on livestock and to move through open high-altitude terrain, corresponded closely in its described behavior and habitat range to the Sherpa classification of the Dazute, the largest category in the traditional Sherpa taxonomy of Yeti-type creatures. The Dazute had been described by Sherpa informants as the highest-ranging form, associated with livestock predation and with tracks that appeared at high elevations. The Tibetan brown bear ranges at those elevations and predates livestock. The correspondence is not proof of equivalence. It is a genuine alignment between a category in an indigenous knowledge tradition and a species in the scientific record. The Lindquist Studies results table, when printed, occupied a modest space on the page. 9 rows, each ending in a species name. The species names were all known, all documented, all within the established fauna of the region. There was no row that ended in an unknown species. There was no row that ended in a question. The table was clean and precise, and researchers reviewing it noted that it represented the first application of whole mitochondrial genome sequencing to a systematic collection of alleged Yeti specimens, making it the highest resolution molecular analysis the question had received to that point. 9 samples, 3 bear species, the rows filled in with notation that was correct and clean, and in its correctness did not quite close the thing it was designed to address. A Himalayan brown bear, standing briefly upright on a boulder at roughly 4,800 meters, leaves a print. Its hind paw is broad and rounded, the toes arranged in a pattern that can read, under the right conditions, at a distance, in snow that has begun to sublimate, under high-altitude sun, as the impression of something bipedal, something large, something whose shape does not immediately resolve into any animal the observer knows. The observer looks at the print in the afternoon light, and the print is 33 centimeters long, or close to it, or wider than expected, and the observer writes down what is there. The observer has not invented the print. The observer has read the print with the instruments available, which are eyes trained on the landscape below the snow line, and the expectation that at this elevation there is not much that is large. The print does not lie. The print is what the snow received when weight came down onto it, and what the sun has done to it in the hours since. Both of those things are true, and neither of them, held alone, accounts for the full shape of what the observer is looking at. The sublimation and solar melting that high-altitude conditions produce on fresh snow is a glaciologically documented process. At elevations above 4,500 meters, direct solar radiation at high altitude is significantly more intense than at sea level, and the low humidity of glacial air means that fresh snow surfaces melt and refreeze and sublimate in patterns that do not follow the same progression as snow at lower elevations. A clear sky day at 5,000 meters can enlarge the width of a fresh footprint by 50 to 100% within 4 to 6 hours of its formation. A print made by a bear's hind paw early in the morning can read by noon as something considerably larger. A trackway made by a 4-footed animal stepping into a soft snow surface can read, by the time an expedition party reaches it 2 hours later, as a bipedal trackway, because the secondary prints of the forepaws have been absorbed into the enlarged depressions made by the hind paws. This is not a theory. This is a process that has been documented in controlled conditions and that applies to every footprint at high altitude on a clear day, regardless of the animal that made it. It is part of the explanation that the scientific literature offers for at least some fraction of the documented track discoveries above the snow line. It does not account for every track that has been documented, and researchers have not claimed that it does. Michael Ward, who was present when the Shipton party followed the Menlung Glacier trackway in 1951, maintained throughout his life that the prints showed no signs of significant distortion at the time of discovery. Ward was a physician with extensive Himalayan experience, and his assessment of the print's condition at the moment of observation is part of the evidentiary record, not separately verifiable, but not lightly dismissed. The solar enlargement mechanism is a genuine and important part of the scientific analysis of Himalayan track discoveries. It is not by itself a complete explanation of the documented record. The two things can both be true. The mechanism is real, and the record contains cases that the mechanism does not neatly account for. The Brian Sykes study generated a follow-up. In 2016, a team of researchers, led by Eliezer Gutierrez and Ronald Pine, published a response in Zookeys, arguing that the two Himalayan samples that had returned the Pleistocene polar bear match in Sykes's 2014 study had been misidentified, and that the sequence in question actually matched Ursus arctos, the brown bear, rather than a Pleistocene polar bear fossil, and that the match Sykes had observed was an artifact of the reference sequence used for comparison, rather than a signal of any genuinely anomalous population. They argued that when the comparison was run against a more complete reference database, the samples resolved into known brown bear lineages without a residual anomaly. Sykes responded to this critique in publications and interviews, maintaining that his analysis had been methodologically sound and that the critique did not account for all the features of the sequence he had identified. The exchange between the two positions remained in the published literature without formal resolution. The sequence that generated the debate is still in the database. What it means and what produced it remains, in the technical sense, a matter that the scientific community has not closed with a consensus finding. What the laboratory work, taken as a whole, has established is this: the physical specimens that have been recoverable and testable using molecular techniques, the hairs, the bones, the skin samples, the fecal material, have returned results consistent with known species in the region, primarily bears, with the Tibetan brown bear, the Himalayan brown bear, and the Asian black bear, accounting for the identified material across multiple studies. No specimen that has undergone rigorous molecular analysis has returned a sequence assignable to an unknown primate. The Pangboche hand resolved to human material. The Kumjung scalp resolved to ungulate material. The overwhelming majority of hair samples resolved to known regional fauna. 2 samples in the Sykes study returned an anomalous result that remains disputed in the peer-reviewed literature. The 2017 Lindquist study, which applied the highest available methodological resolution to 9 specimens, returned results that were entirely consistent with known bears. What the laboratory work has not established is an explanation for the complete documented record of footprint discoveries, close-range bipedal sightings, and independent cross-cultural reports spanning multiple decades and several distinct geographic zones. The specimens that have been tested are a subset of the reported evidence. They are the subset that was recoverable and accessible for analysis. The trackways are not recoverable. The figures observed at distance across snowfields are not recoverable. The independent accounts made by experienced observers over several decades in multiple separate mountain regions are not recoverable in the sense that they cannot be submitted for molecular analysis. They remain what they always were: accounts, observations, records in field journals, and expedition reports, accumulating across time from people who were in the high places and wrote down what they found there. A researcher sitting with the published studies in a warm office somewhere below the snow line holds 2 things at once. On one side of the desk, the Lindquist studies results table, 9 samples, 3 bear species, the notation clean. On the other side, the 1951 Shipton photograph, its footprint 33 centimeters long and 20 centimeters wide, the ice axe lying in the snow beside it for scale. The print's walls still sharp-edged in the cold air of the Menlung Glacier at roughly 5,940 meters above sea level. The specimen table is closed. The photograph is not. The photograph has been in the literature for more than 7 decades, and no study, including the most rigorous molecular analysis so far conducted, has produced an identification that accounts for it. Not because the photograph is supernatural or because it proves something beyond what it shows, but because what it shows, a print of specific dimensions at a specific location, has not been assigned to any particular animal by any methodology that the scientific community has accepted as definitive. The photograph persists. That is its most accurate description at this point in the record. It was taken in November 1951 on a glacier in the Rolwalling Himal of northeastern Nepal by a trained and experienced mountaineer in the company of a physician who later confirmed the trackway's condition at the time of discovery, and it was published in the Illustrated London News within weeks of its production and has been in continuous circulation in the scientific and popular literature since. Every analytical technique that has been applied to the question of anomalous Himalayan track discoveries has been applied to the broader category of evidence, of which the Shipton photograph is the most widely known example. None of those techniques have produced an identification that the scientific community has accepted as closing the question of the Menlung Glacier trackway specifically. The laboratory studies form a genuine body of work. The psych study sequenced 36 samples and produced among its results 2 anomalous matches that remain in the published literature without consensus resolution. The linguist study sequenced 9 specimens with whole mitochondrial genome technology and produced a clean results table attributing all 9 to known bear species. The Pangboyo, hand resolved to human material. The Kumjung scalp, resolved to Sero skin. The laboratory record, read honestly, does 2 things simultaneously. It demonstrates that many physical specimens previously attributed to Yeti encounters are attributable to known species and known human practices, and it does not demonstrate that the complete documented record of tracks, sightings, and independent observations across nearly a century has been accounted for. Both of those things emerge from the same body of research. They are not in contradiction. They are both simply what the research found. The Tibetan brown bear ranges through high-altitude terrain that overlaps substantially with the elevation band of the most credible Himalayan track discoveries. It is a large animal. It walks at times in a manner that places weight differently on its hind legs than bears at lower elevations are typically observed to do. It is critically endangered and rarely seen by observers in the field. Its tracks, fresh in the early morning snow and observed by a human eye trained for the landscape below the snow line, are not necessarily immediately legible as bear tracks. These things are also part of the evidentiary record, established by zoologists and field researchers with direct knowledge of the species and its range. The Tibetan brown bear is a real animal in the places where the tracks have been found. It is a plausible and evidentially supported explanation for a significant portion of the documented record. Whether it is a complete explanation is a question the scientific literature has not formally resolved. There is a particular quality to the open cases in the scientific literature, not the dramatically unresolved ones, not the cases that generate popular attention precisely because they seem to resist resolution. The quietly open ones, the cases that have been examined seriously with the best available tools by researchers with no obvious agenda for a particular outcome and that have returned results that are accurate and insufficient in equal measure. The Yeti question in its current scientific form is one of those. The laboratory has done what the laboratory can do with the material it has received. The material it has received is a subset of the evidence. The subset resolved toward known species. The whole remains open. In a laboratory at Oxford, in 2013, 36 small tubes stood in a rack, and each one held a hair attributed to something large and unidentified in the mountains. Most of them resolved. 2 of them returned something unexpected, and the unexpected result passed into the literature and generated a response, and the response generated a reply, and the exchange sits in the database now, unresolved, alongside the other exchanges that constitute the scientific record of this question. The laboratory was quiet while the sequencing ran. The samples were small. The results were precise, and in their precision they answered what they could answer, and left the rest the way a careful study always leaves the rest: acknowledged, described, and open. The 2017 results table lies on a researcher's desk in the particular silence of a late evening office. 9 rows, 3 bear species. The notation is clean, and the conclusion is exactly as far as the evidence goes, which is where honest science always rests. Beside it, on the same desk, the Shipton photograph, not a reproduction from a book, but a print made from a digital archive scan of the original 1951 image, its resolution good enough to make the ice axe's grain readable, good enough to see the shadow falling across the inside wall of the print, good enough to read the dimensions without any instrument other than the eye and the knowledge of the axe's length. The print is 33 centimeters long. The print is 20 centimeters wide. The print is on a glacier at approximately 5,940 meters in the roll-walling Himal of northeastern Nepal, and the glacier is there now in the dark, many thousands of feet above anything living that we have named, its surface moving imperceptibly in the way glaciers move, its ice old and slow and indifferent to any investigation conducted in a warm room below. The results table does not have a row for the Menlung Glacier trackway. No study has produced one.